Well, hello everyone, how are you doing this fine day? Hope you're enjoying your week. Welcome to another survival challenge, in particular, a War of the Monsters survival challenge. And boy, is this so exciting. Okay, so I recently did an Evolve survival challenge and had a lot of people in the comments coming in being like, oh my god, this really brings me back, it's so nostalgic, I remember playing this as a little child boy. I personally didn't really feel anything nostalgic when playing Evolve. Like, Evolve came out in 2015. That wasn't that long ago. Like, I was a grown-ass man when that game came out. I just wasn't young enough to feel that sort of attachment to it like a lot of people did. However, War of the Monsters came out in 2003. The game's gonna be 22 years old in like 2 months. I was a youngin' when I played this game. It was before I knew the touch of a woman. Wait, 2003? No, never mind. But I was young. I love this fucking game. It's so good, and I want to talk about it. So hope you enjoy the video. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share, and join the membership. Remember, if you join the membership, you get videos early. But that's enough wasting your time. Let's get started. So the basic premise of War of the Monsters is an alien invasion happens to an alternate 1950s Earth. A couple of their ships crash land, and then there's this like weird alien fluid shit that's inside the ship. It's the fuel that powers their ships. It falls out and it just sort of spreads across the world in different points. And whatever it comes into contact with, it turns that thing into this giant, all-powerful kaiju. So now you have a version of 1950s Earth that is being invaded by aliens and is also just covered with massive fucking kaiju. And to no one's surprise, that leads to a massive war of all different kinds of monsters. Ergo, War of the Monsters. And that's it. That's the whole story. Yeah, you see, War of the Monster came out in a very, very different time. Story was not particularly focused on. In fact, if you want to know anything about any of the monsters in the game, anything about the story, it's not in the actual game. You have to read the manual, like the manual that comes with the game. Oh, right, young people. Okay, a manual is a book that used to come with the games when we used to buy physical copies. We would go to a store and we would purchase the game and it would come in a little book, and that book had all sorts of interesting information about the game that you were about to play, including important story details like characterizations and things that a lot of times wasn't actually in the game. Fuck. A store is a place that you used to go to when you needed to buy things. So if you played through all of War of the Monsters, beat the game with every single character, unlocked all the costumes, and that's really all you could do with games back then. Unless you read the manual, it's very possible you still had no fucking idea what this game was about, or why any of these characters were doing the things that they were doing. And to be perfectly honest with you, as far as this goes, War of the Monsters did not do it the best. Even if you do read the manual, most of the characters don't have motivations for why they're doing anything. They just go through the story and do what they do because they have to. It's a game and it's just an excuse for them to fight people. Some of the characters on the roster that you play as don't even have a backstory. There's a bone dragon in this game that doesn't have a backstory. It's a dragon made of bones, and we have no fucking idea why he's here. That's some shit that needs to be explained. So unlike most of my videos where characterization comes into play and we actually see how these different people will come into contact and what decisions they'll make, there's really not enough here for me to do that. For the most part, it's just gonna be who's gonna punch who the hardest. Then the question becomes, what exactly can these characters do? And in terms of kaiju powers, there's actually quite a lot. There's a few things that literally all of the kaiju can do. They're all around 30 meters tall. Some are a little bit shorter, some are a little bit taller, but they're all about 30 meters. They're all strong enough to completely destroy skyscrapers and tank basically anything humanity can throw at them. There's this move you can use in the game where you pick up some kind of spear-shaped giant object, and then you can chuck it at the other monsters. If you hit them, it skewers through their chest, and then they're like stunned for a second, they have to rip the thing out, and then they continue fighting. Every single monster is not only capable of doing this, but also capable of having this done to them and be fine, just survive and just continue fighting. Basically, every single monster on the roster can fight with a giant fucking hole in their chest, and it really doesn't slow them down or bother them at all. Every single monster is capable of regenerating from damage. Some monsters have more regen than others, and I'll get into that later on when I talk about specifics, but they all have some form of regen. In terms of durability, they can take a shocking amount of damage. At one point in the game, when you're fighting the second boss, this giant vegetable monster thing, you're fighting him on this island that's just a giant nuclear power plant. Right before the fight happens, the plant explodes, turning the entire island into a massive crater. Now, I've actually seen people say that this is large town level based on the size of the crater on the island, but I looked at those calculations and I reject this completely because it's wrong. That math is based on the size of the crater that you're standing in during the fight, but it completely ignores anything that happens outside of that crater. For instance, throughout the level before the island turns into a fucking crater, if you look away from the island, you can see this city way across on this body of water. It's several miles away. You can just kind of see the silhouettes of all these buildings. After this massive explosion happens, and during the actual boss fight, if you look over to the buildings again, they're all completely fucking destroyed. The calculation that they used of large town level does not factor in the fact that the explosion reached across this massive lake and completely destroyed an entire coastal city several miles away. I'm not about to calculate this. I'm not a fucking mathematician, but it's a hell of a lot more than large town level. Someone somewhere needs to recalculate this and see how much it is. Because no matter what calculation I saw online, none of them factored in the destruction of the city off the coast. Not only does your character survive this explosion, but they're completely undamaged by it. And it happens in the story no matter what character you pick, which means the entire roster is this physically durable. In terms of speed, the only way you can calculate how fast characters are is by comparing them to the different projectile speeds of the game. So there's sort of this meta in the game where every character you pick has different stats that are based on low, medium, or high. One of those stats is projectile speed. Every single kaiju in the game has a projectile speed. Some are slow, some are medium, some are high, right? There's a character in the game named Kongar who's basically like the King Kong type character. He's a giant fucking chimpanzee ape fusion. And all of his projectiles are sonic based. His long range attacks are sonic roars. And in the meta of the game, his long range attacks are considered medium speed. Now, in terms of the gameplay, this travel speed is important because it means you can more easily dodge the projectiles that are being shot at you. There are other characters in the game who have projectiles that travel at fast speeds. And as I said, all of these are dodgeable. This means at bare minimum, the slowest kaiju in the game can dodge attacks that are faster than sound. There's a kaiju in the game who uses electricity as a projectile. There's another one that uses lasers. All of these characters' projectiles move faster than the speed of sound, and every single character can dodge them. This would put the entire roster of War of the Monsters at supersonic to possibly hypersonic reaction speeds. Pretty fucking fast for a bunch of dudes who are like 100,000 tons. And lastly, all the monsters should be, to some extent, self-sustaining, with the exception of Zorgulon, who I will get to in a minute. And this is for a couple of reasons. For one, there's a section of the game where you go up into space and you actually fight on the alien spacecraft. And we know, based on the design of the aliens, that they cannot breathe on Earth. They all require breathers when they come down to Earth because they cannot breathe our oxygen. Because of that, there's no reason to think that there's any oxygen on their spaceship up in space. And literally everyone on the roster is capable of being up there for very long amounts of time, fighting a fucking army of aliens without having any issues whatsoever. There's also characters that just don't have lungs. Like, there's a character that's made out of magma, one that's made out of electricity, there's one that's just a giant rock monster, there's one a character that's just a skeleton. So it would just make sense that these characters don't need things like food or sleep or air. But yeah, I think as far as the powers that all of the characters have, that's about it. Now let's get into what each character can do individually. First off, we have Kongar, who I already kind of talked about. He's a giant ape kaiju, and he has sonic attacks. He's King Kong with a black canary scream, basically. What we know about him is he was originally a chimpanzee that worked for NASA. Can you say that a space chimp works for whatever. Anyway, he was with NASA and they sent him up in a spaceship. And while he was up there, one of the alien spacecrafts ran into it, and then he got covered in that fuel, turned into a kaiju, and then crash landed back to Earth. He was completely undamaged. He got up and he just started his fucking chaos across the world. He was the first being on Earth to come into contact with the aliens, as well as the first being to actually become a kaiju. And it's also a pretty cool detail that he survived atmospheric re-entry. Togera is part of an ancient dinosaur species that went extinct a long time ago. He's the last one, and he was in hibernation when he was hit by the alien fuel, which not only woke him up, but made him vastly more powerful. He basically has the powers of Spike from X-Men Evolution, remember? The black dude who can make like bone spikes and shit grow from his body. Yeah, he can do that. He can also fire this plasma nuclear breath, much in the same way that Godzilla can fire his atomic breath. This is actually pretty important because every single monster on the roster is not only capable of surviving it, but surviving it like really easily. It doesn't actually do all that much damage to them. So every single kaiju in this game should have very high resistance to not only nuclear radiation, but also very high heat, as, you know, plasma's pretty fucking hot. Praetor was just a regular praying mantis until a mad scientist decided to purposely put the alien fuel onto it. Don't know why the fuck you do that. It became a giant kaiju and it got the powers to basically control parasites. It fires out this massive fucking parasite that grabs onto people, infects them, and just starts stealing their life force away from them. Not only is it shown in the gameplay, but the creator of the game has also stated that within the lore, Praetor is the fastest monster in the entire game, as well as being the least durable. Having said that, even though it is the least durable, it still survives that giant island nuke shit I was talking about earlier without taking any damage. So, I mean, you know, take that with a grain of salt. She also has the distinction of being the only female monster in the entire game. Robot 47 is a giant robot that was created during the Atomic Age that was kind of just discarded because it was thought to be out of date. That wasn't until an alien spacecraft smashed through the roof and ran right into it and leaked a bunch of alien fuel onto it, which reactivated its circuitry. I don't know how the fuck that works. And it got a massive upgrade. The fact that it was created by America means it was created very American. It has basically every weapon you could possibly think of inside of it, from machine guns to rocket launchers, lasers. It's got swords and saw blades and spikes and machine guns, and it even has a giant nuke launcher that is stated in the lore to be able to level an entire city block. It's also important to note that after Robo 47 was successful against fighting against so many monsters, the United States decided to start mass producing these motherfuckers, so there's actually a lot of them. But obviously, if America does something, somebody else has to copy it somewhere. And I say that with absolutely no irony whatsoever. As we go over to Japan and Ultra V, their version of a giant robot. Ultra V was actually not built to be a robot, but a mech. It's supposed to have a pilot in it. But in an attempt to power it without wrecking their entire fucking economy, they decided to use the alien fuel, which didn't just power it, but it gave it sentience. Okay. So it's a giant mech that's supposed to have a pilot that doesn't actually need a pilot. It can just walk around and talk, and it's just like a normal dude. It's also the only character on the roster that knows martial arts, and it has a big-ass laser sword. Laser swords are always cool. So now the robots are done, let's get to the elemental-type monsters, I guess. First up, we have Kineticlops, which is a monster made out of electricity with like a floating eyeball inside of it. Originally, he was a security guard that worked at a power plant, and then there was some alien fuel, and it fused him with the electricity, creating Kineticlops. This makes him the only monster in the entire game that was once human. And while many of the monsters in War of the Monsters, we can't actually determine how smart they are, Kineticlops, we can actually say, has human-level intellect. Actually, Kineticlops is the character that we have the most information on, and because of that, he has some of the coolest and most broken powers in the entire game. So just a couple things he can do. He is made out of electricity, which means he can basically phase into electrical circuits and things like that and travel via electricity. This includes the eyeball that looks biological. Like, the eyeball doesn't look like it's made out of electricity, but that can turn into electricity so that he can travel. We see him do it when he pops out of electrical circuits in the game. He's also stated to be a perfect fusion of biology and electricity. Like, the electricity is described as being biological because it's like a weird energy biofusion. I don't really know what that means in terms of power, but it's pretty cool. He's also stated to be able to cover an entire city with electricity. This makes him the character with not only the best range, but also the biggest area of effect attack in the entire game. In the game, he can't actually do this, but it is stated in the lore that he can. And lastly, this is one that people are probably going to argue with me on, but he seems to be able to multiply himself and create a sort of hive mind of many different Kineticlops. And the reason why I say this is because in his backstory, he's just stated to be one guy, just a security guard who became Kineticlops. There's no evidence of anyone else becoming Kineticlops. And then in the nuclear plant level, you have to fight like 30 of these motherfuckers. So where did all these other Kineticlops come from? There's no evidence that there were a bunch of different dudes who became Kineticlops. It's just this one guy. So the assumption there would be that all these Kineticlops are just the one dude who are kind of just a hive mind. Again, maybe that's taking a bit of a leap, but if you're gonna say that, you have to give me an explanation as to why there's so many, and yet the only description of the character that we're given says that it's just one dude. The creators of War of the Monsters also went off to make another game where they put Kineticlops in it as a guest character, and in that game it stated in his character description that he can control his size at will. So it could be possible that he can grow bigger than the 30 meters that we see him as, but I don't take any of the information that we get from that game all that seriously, because in his character description they also completely changed his background and his origin, so I don't really see him as the same character, just that they use the same design as sort of like a cool reference on this brand new character. The last elemental character we have is Magmo, and you know the drill with these character backstories. There was a volcano, a ship crash landed inside the volcano, some of that fuel got into it, and transformed the lava into a living being known as Magmo. We don't have a ton of information on his character, but what we do know is that his personality is very much that of a volcano, where they describe him as this very volatile, rage-filled beast who just lashes out at everything around him. He's also stated to be the physically strongest of all the monsters in the game, and while he's not capable of multiplying himself like Kineticlops can, he does seem to be able to generate more lava, as all of his projectiles are him firing lava out of himself, and he could just keep doing it. There doesn't seem to be any limit to it. So the only way this would be possible is if he constantly regenerates magma. This would also mean that he has one of the best regens in the game. Not the best, probably second best. And something that's important to note for both Magmo and Kineticlops is that since Kineticlops is lightning and Magmo is lava, and they could both be punched to death by basically any person on the roster, we have to assume that all of these monsters have some sort of armament hockey type powers where they are capable of punching beings who should not normally be able to be physically touched. You can't just punch lightning, but in the game, not only can they punch lightning, they can grab it, they can chuck it around, and they can even beat it to death. In reality, in order to harm something like lightning or magma, something that should not be capable of being harmed physically, you would have to have some sort of technology or some sort of power that would allow you to do that. And all of the monsters in War of the Monsters do have it. Last up for the elemental monsters is Agamo. Earlier in the video, I talked about how every character has regen, but one character in particular has better regen than everybody else. Agamo is who I was talking about. It's actually stated in the lore of the game that he is capable of controlling his own molecules, and this is shown in a couple of different ways. One of his abilities is him being able to take his head off and chuck it at people, and then he just regrows a head. He also has an ability that allows him to just grow a rock out of nothing, like a massive fucking boulder, and then just chuck it at people. So it seems like his molecular manipulation comes in the form of him just being able to create something out of nothing, including his own body parts, meaning he should easily have the absolute best healing in the entire game, and for any normal person attacking him, they may not even be able to beat him if he can just recreate himself via molecular manipulation. This actually makes a lot of sense that he would have a crazy power like this, because he is actually a god in the game. None of the other giant kaiju are gods, they're just mutated monstrosities. He's literally a god. Next up we have Raptros, who is a dragon. He can do all the things that a dragon can do. Can a dragon do it? Okay, Raptros can do it. That's really all I could say, because this is the one character that has zero lore at all. He has nothing in the manual, no developer statements, nothing. He's literally just a dragon in this world that's just here for some reason. We have no idea where he came from or why he's here. The only thing I can really say about him is that he's not the only one. There seems to be tons of dragons in this world. We see like 4 or 5 in the game, and Raptros is just the main one that you can play as, but there seem to be like a whole race of dragons here. The last monster we have on the roster is Zorgulon, and kind of like Raptros, there's not a ton of information in the actual manual, but the developer of the game has come out and talked about him a little bit. And what he said was Zorgulon used to be one of the kings of this alien race that is invading, and then when they got to Earth, there was a mutiny, and the aliens kicked him out and booted him down to Earth. He is now super fucking salty about it and decided to turn on his own species and kill them all out of spite for them betraying him and trying to abandon him on this backwater planet. This actually makes Zorgulon easily the most interesting character with the most interesting storyline in the entire game. It's a shame that it's not actually in the game. Zorgulon is also one of only 2 characters on the roster that was not given any powers by the alien fuel, as he is an alien himself, and it doesn't seem to affect them the same way it affects beings on Earth. Because of that, Zorgulon doesn't actually have all the same powers that a lot of the other ones has. All of his abilities come from technology. He has like a little laser pistol, and his special is him being able to summon a bunch of drone saucers that are like the size of airline planes, and then they show up and they just start firing on his enemies. He also has to have one of those rebreathers at all times, because he cannot breathe in Earth's oxygen, which is something that none of the other monsters need. So it does kind of sound like he's one of the weakest ones. However, it should be noted, he's also the most intelligent of all of the monsters by a massive margin. Outside of all that, the only other monsters that exist in the world are basically the boss monsters. You have Cerebulon, who is basically the guy who took over after he ostracized Zorbulon, and he basically just looks exactly like Zorbulon, except he's in this massive metal walking monstrosity that's easily over 3 times the size of any of the monsters on the actual roster. He's one of the most powerful monsters in the game. However, it is important to note that literally every single monster in the roster is capable of defeating him, so maybe not all that strong. There's also a monster known as Vegron or Vegeron. I'm forgetting his name. Doesn't matter. He's a giant fucking plant dude. He's probably the biggest monster in the entire game, but he's not really going to be much of a factor because he lives in the ground and there's really no evidence that he can go anywhere. So as long as any of the people in this world don't go to the one spot where he exists buried in the ground, you should be fine. Like, there's no evidence that he can travel underground or go to new locations. He's just a fucking giant plant monster. And then you do have humanity, who actually has a bunch of cool technology. They have other giant robots and all different kind of stuff they use to fight people, even bigger robots than things like Robo 47. And that may become an issue at some point, but honestly, like I said, all the monsters on the roster do beat all of them, so it really doesn't matter if the challengers can overcome it or not, because it's really going to be the roster of the game that's going to be the thing that they're going to have to overcome, since those are the strongest beings in the entire War of the Monsters universe. And I'm pretty sure that's everything. I think we're done. We can move on to the actual challengers. So let's do that. First up on the chopping block, we have Godzilla from the Monsterverse. And look, guys, I don't like making people angry. That's not my goal when I make these videos. However, people really like to be angry. And there doesn't really seem to be anything that I can do about that. It doesn't really matter what video I make, what I talk about, how correct my information is or how incorrect my information is. The anger that people feel towards my videos stays the same regardless. There have been times where, as a joke, I literally did totally wrong information and the anger levels did not raise at all. Exact same anger levels either way. So my options seem to be, I could just try to say only the things that I think everyone will like, which isn't possible, and will still make people angry, or I could just say whatever the fuck I want. So I'm gonna do that one. And the reason why I bring this up is because I was shocked months ago when I realized there's actually a large number of people who really love the Monsterverse. I don't know why. I mean, they're fine, I guess. They're not good. They're not bad either. They're okay. They exist. But despite that, to my surprise, there has been a relatively large community that has built up around the Monsterverse, including a very large scaling community and multiple YouTube channels that solely exist to scale and talk about the power levels of the Monsterverse. And there really is no getting around it. These people are fucking wrong. Their arguments and evidence around how the Monsterverse is so ungodly powerful are based around half-truths, leaving out vital information, and sometimes just outright lies. So for basically this entire Godzilla portion of the video, that's what I'm gonna talk about. So depending on who you talk to in the Monsterverse scaling community, you'll get different answers about just how strong these Monsterverse kaiju are. Some people have them at country, some people have continental, some have them as high as planetary. But regardless of where they put these characters at on the scale, the arguments are most of the time basically the same. They're pulling them from like 3 or 4 different feats, and I don't think that those feats are true. At least not true in the way that they talk about them. So I'm gonna get into as many arguments as I can remember off the top of my head, because these videos aren't scripted, and then I'm just gonna say why I think that they're bullshit. Sound good? Cool. Shimo caused the Ice Age. In Godzilla X Kong, they introduced a kaiju named Shimo. Shimo is not as powerful as Godzilla, but is stated in the movie to be the reason the Ice Age happened. She caused the Ice Age. And people have calculated her doing this at like multi-continent level because the Ice Age was freezing the entire northern half of the planet. The problem is that these calculations are based on the idea that she did it in a single moment instantaneously, which is not the case. The Ice Age that she caused is a stand-in for our real world Ice Age. So why would they take the landmass that was frozen into account, like the real world landmass that actually froze, but not the time period that it took to actually happen? In the real world, the Ice Age took over 10,000 years to actually freeze to that degree. It started up at the very top of the planet and then slowly worked its way down until it covered the entire northern half of the planet. She could have literally dropped the temperature of the planet a fraction of a degrees each year, and in 10,000 years, she would have frozen the planet. She could have decided to freeze like a decent amount of land every couple of months, taking breaks here and there, and then over the course of 10,000 years, boom, she froze the entire northern half of the planet. The only way that you can calculate this as being impressive is if you completely ignore the time frame, which is exactly what people do. So no, this feat isn't really impressive, unless the movies state that it was done instantaneously. Because as of right now, the only timetable we can go by is the real world timetable, which was too long for this feat to even fucking matter. Godzilla tanked the meteor that killed the dinosaurs. No, he didn't. This feat comes from a comic book, but what people say happened here didn't actually happen. So if you look at the first page of the comic, they show Godzilla beating the fuck out of this poor other kaiju, and then you see a meteor coming down to hit him. The next page, we see this massive explosion on the surface of Earth that it appears to have hit him. But if you look over just a couple of inches to the panel to the right, literally the next panel, you see that he's standing there just fine, and the rock that was going to hit him was a small pebble that fell down a crack in the ground. This panel happens after this panel. So why are people saying that he was hit by this fucking massive explosion? The Shimo feat, I don't think people were lying. I think people just didn't think it all the way through. This feat is a straight up lie. He does not get hit by the meteor. To give you some context of what is actually happening here, this section of the comic book, this doctor guy is talking about the possibilities of what had happened in the past. At one point, he talks about the possibility that Godzilla was actually sleeping throughout the entire existence of the dinosaurs and that he predates them by millions of years. In one possibility, this one, you see that he could have been on the Earth when the meteor hit. But at no point does he theorize that the meteor actually fucking hit him in the face. And even in the theory where he's talking about the meteor hitting, he doesn't even know if Godzilla was on the surface at the time or not. A couple pages later, he admits that he doesn't even know where Godzilla was sleeping on Earth that whole time. He's just throwing out random theories and random possibilities, and the comic is showing what those possibilities could look like. But we see multiple variations of it. I mean, shit, in one of these movies while he's fighting, he gets grabbed and picked up and carried through the sky to the point that he's like above the clouds. And then the dude drops him and he hits the ground and nearly fucking kills him. I already showed you earlier when Kongar actually survived re-entry from space, hit the ground, made a huge crater, and then got up like it was no problem. Godzilla was nearly killed from a drop that wasn't half as high. And I'm supposed to believe that he tanked a meteor that killed all life on Earth? Bullshit. Godzilla drilled to the hollow Earth. So this is the main argument that most people like to talk about, and I kind of have to attack it in sort of a three-pronged structure because there's sort of like bullshit on top of bullshit on top of bullshit with this one. Basically, in Godzilla vs. Kong, Godzilla has to drill down to the hollow Earth. So he stands there and he shoots his atomic breath down and he drills a hole all the way from the surface down to the hollow Earth. And people calculate that at being like super, super high country or continental or whatever. Some people have calculated as far as moon or even planetary. And there's three reasons why they do this. One, the on-screen time that it takes for Godzilla to do this is about 3.5 minutes. Two, at one point in the films, there's this hologram where they show what the hollow Earth actually looks like, and they take this little hologrammed map and they look at how deep it is and they calculate that with how long it took. And three, there was a Twitter post by one of the creators of the MonsterVerse who said that Godzilla has these neurosynthetic glands at his neck that basically causes neurosynthesis and creates the atomic breath that allows him to shoot it. Now, neurosynthesis is basically swapping around the atomic structure of things in order to create new atoms. Now, people took that information and fucking ran with it and say that because it's neurosynthesis that creates the atomic breath, that means that the atomic breath actually is completely destroying the atoms that it's hitting, ergo it is a more powerful attack than it would normally be. So these three arguments all combined put this shit up at like moon or planetary or some shit. The problem with that is all three of these arguments are bullshit. So the first argument is the time. On screen, it took about 3.5 minutes for him to drill down into the hollow Earth. The problem I have with this is that it's a fucking movie, and movies don't play out in real time. Within this 3.5 minutes, the camera jumps back and forth between 4 different scenes. Why are you assuming that with all of this jumping around between all these different scenes, 0 time is passing by whatsoever? That's how movies work. When a movie jumps from one scene to another, you don't assume that these scenes are happening literally back to back. For all we know, it took him 20 minutes to actually drill through, and we're just seeing 3 minutes because you're not gonna fucking sit there and watch 20 minutes of him drilling. It's so weird to time something in this way in a movie. Like when you watch a 2-hour movie, do you assume that 2 hours passed in the actual timeline of the movie? No. So why would you assume that here? It's weird. Of course, when he starts drilling, he's gonna finish drilling relatively soon. It's the climax of the movie. But even if it did take 3.5 minutes, it's still not as powerful as you say it is. And the reason for that is because of the next 2 arguments. This map of Hollow Earth is not actually a map of Hollow Earth. At the point that this map is shown in the series, no human being in the MonsterVerse had ever been to Hollow Earth yet. And later later on in the series, they have multiple characters who state that they haven't fully mapped out Hollow Earth, and it's considerably bigger than they thought it was. In other words, this map is wrong, and the series straight up calls it out for being wrong. This is just an estimation of what they think the Hollow Earth looks like. But this isn't it. We don't know how deep Hollow Earth is, but we do know it's not as deep as this map is because the characters directly state that it is. Meaning that the calculations that they do based on the depth of Hollow Earth based on this picture is wrong. We don't know how wrong it is, but it's wrong. So we know he didn't drill this fucking deep, and chances are it didn't take 3.5 minutes to do it. But the absolute most mind-boggling argument here is saying that the neurosynthetic glands that create his atomic breath somehow gives his atomic breath ability to atomize the things that it shoots at. Fucking why? Just because you use neurosynthesis to create an element doesn't mean that element has the properties of neurosynthesis. For example, if I took 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, H2O, and I put them together and create water, that is neurosynthesis. I am taking 2 different atoms and creating a new thing, right? Cool. Now, when I put that water in a petri dish or I throw it in a lake or whatever, is it gonna suddenly start neurosynthesizing all the shit that I put it against? No, it doesn't get fucking superpowers just because I created it that way. The neurosynthetic glands does not give the atomic breath a power up. This is a really weird argument. We see the atomic breath hit characters like Kong, and it burns his flesh, and it sucks to be hit by it, but it doesn't completely destroy atoms. This is the most bullshit ass pull, I just made some shit up because point that exists in the entire series. It's terrible. And all 3 of these points taken and put together is how they're able to get this one feat to get so fucking ungodly powerful, when in reality, Godzilla was drilling a hole for an unspecified amount of time and got into Hollow Earth that we don't know how deep it is. That's it. That's the whole feat. The fact that some people try to get this shit up to planetary is insane. He's literally firing the fucking blast down at the planet, and the planet is fine. How is it planetary? Godzilla's many power-ups. So I don't think that this is an argument that a lot of people use, but I have seen it. If you go to Versus Battle and you look at all of their attack potencies and shit, you'll see that they take all these different little power-ups that Godzilla has gotten in each movie, and they assume that those power-ups are permanent and continue on into the next movie, so that all of future power-ups are getting compounded on top of that previous power-up. So they just keep making him stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger as the movies go on, when in reality, though, he doesn't keep those power-ups at all. We know this. The movie shows us he doesn't keep okay, so if you go to Versus Battle Wiki, they have a little section where they talk about how he gets the power-up in King of the Monsters. When he's fighting Ghidorah, he glows in this sort of orange fire, and he starts pulsating this orange energy, and he fucking obliterates Ghidorah when Ghidorah previously was way more powerful than him. This is a massive power-up that he gets for this fight because he absorbs a ton of energy. If you keep reading on the wiki, they say that in the next movie he's superior to that, and the next movie he's superior to that, and he just keeps going and going and going. But that movie's the only time we ever see him do this shit, because it was a one-time temporary power-up. Because how Godzilla's powers work is he absorbs energy, and energy isn't permanent, it dissipates. It lowers over time. He can't absorb a bunch of energy in 2019 and expect to still have it in 2024. That's not how this shit works. That's not how any energy works. And we see time and time again that it doesn't work this way in the Monsterverse. Like I said, he doesn't have this power after this movie. He never uses this ability again. But that's not the only time we see that those powers go away. In Godzilla vs. Kong, Kong and Godzilla team up to fight against Mechagodzilla, and neither of them can overcome him on his own. Kong has this axe that is made out of a piece of Godzilla, or a piece of Godzilla's race, and it has the ability to absorb energy. Godzilla then shoots that piece with his atomic breath, which makes it glow like super, super bright blue, and then it's strong enough to cut through Mechagodzilla. Then he just slices Mechagodzilla up and he wins, and it's all cool. The glowing of the axe is showing you that the energy is in there. A couple minutes after the fight, next time it shows him holding the axe, it's not glowing anymore because the energy dissipated. It doesn't just hold it there forever. And that's the same way Godzilla works. I'm not saying that Godzilla doesn't gain any power. He doesn't get any stronger over the course of any of these movies. Of course he does. But he doesn't keep every single massive power-up. When you have a scene where a character says, Godzilla is twice as strong as he was prior, or Godzilla is 20 times the strength he was, that doesn't just keep compounding throughout each film like Versus Battle Wiki says it does. That would make this motherfucker like 120 times stronger than he was in the first Godzilla. No, he's not. And this is just yet another way that they try to jury-rig the numbers to get this motherfucker as strong as humanly possible. So I think I touched on enough arguments. I'm sure that there's some that I'm forgetting. If I did, comment below. Maybe I'll make a response video. I don't know. It depends. But for now, we're moving on. How exactly would Godzilla do in the War of the Monsters universe? Well, actually, it really doesn't matter how we do this. We could do it with Godzilla going in the War of the Monsters universe, the entirety of the War of the Monsters universe going into the Monsterverse universe. Like I said, it doesn't matter. Godzilla's getting his fucking shit pushed in. It's really not even close. He's considerably slower than literally everyone on the roster, since they can literally dodge shit that's faster than sound and actually see and react to it in real time, something no one in the Monsterverse can do. They're way more durable, as the explosion that happened on the power plant that destroyed the outer city is considerably larger than anything that's happened in the Monsterverse up to this point. Now, I will say Godzilla would survive that explosion because it's a nuclear explosion, and Godzilla is empowered by nuclear energy, but that doesn't mean that he's just as durable. You're literally hitting him with the thing that makes him stronger. If you replace that size explosion with literally anything else that's not nuclear, it would turn Godzilla into paste. And that's sort of another argument that I think that people are probably going to bring up, is that all of the different nukes that he's been able to tank. The problem is that Godzilla isn't actually tanking them. He has energy absorption abilities. He's capable of absorbing nuclear radiation. These bombs are empowering him. He doesn't have to be physically durable enough to take the explosion, because the second the explosion hits him, he's getting stronger. And there is going to be a little bit of that in the War of the Monsters universe. If he fights Robo-47, Robo-47 has some nuclear attacks that are going to make him stronger. Togera has nuclear attacks that are going to make him stronger. But the vast majority of characters don't have nuclear attacks, but their attacks are just as strong, if not stronger than nukes, and they're going to easily bring Godzilla to Pound Town. The only thing that Godzilla actually has that's superior than them is his size. He's about 300 to 400 feet tall, whereas most of these kaiju are around 100 feet tall, but that doesn't really say much. There are kaiju in War of the Monsters universe that are very close to the size of Godzilla, and all the kaiju from War of the Monsters are capable of defeating them, so I don't really see that being all that much of a problem. And then you have the elemental kaiju in War of the Monsters that Godzilla is literally incapable of harming in any way. How is he going to hurt pure electricity or pure magma or a fucking stone being that can just recreate his own atoms if Godzilla destroys it? And even if he could do that, even if he could somehow defeat energy and substances, the fact of the matter is that Godzilla's main strength comes from his atomic breath, which literally every single person on the roster has a very high resistance to. As I said, a massive nuclear explosion hit all of them and did 0 damage. Togera's main attack is a plasma nuclear blast, which all of them can take, and it doesn't really do a whole lot. There are several Godzilla movies in the Monsterverse where Godzilla is actually kind of getting his ass kicked, and his atomic breath is really the only thing that he has over his opponents and defeats them. He's kind of sort of a one-trick pony in that way. But his main attack that completely slaughters everyone he goes up against isn't really going to be that effective here. And on certain characters, it's not going to do anything. So yeah, it really doesn't matter how we do this. Godzilla dies, Kong dies, Ghidorah dies, Shimo dies. Nobody in the Monsterverse can survive the War of the Monsters universe. Next up on the list, we have Crypto Spiridium from the Destroy All Humans series. Crypto is a member of an alien race known as the Furon. A long, long time ago, the Furon went to war with another alien race known as the Blisk. The Blisk was an alien race that is super hyper radioactive. Their entire planet is toxic and shitty. And because of this, the Furon's war with them caused them to mutate and sort of fucked their DNA up really, really bad, to such an extent that all of their children started being born without penises. So bad that all their children started being born without genitalia. For obvious reasons, this meant that their race was on a timer and they would inevitably die out since they can't reproduce. To counteract this, they started cloning themselves as a way to allow their species to live on, but that caused problems in its own as their cloning technology wasn't perfect. They couldn't create a perfect clone of whoever it was they cloned, and due to this, because of generations and generations of cloning, like they initially cloned one dude and then the next clone would have to be a clone of a clone, and the next clone would have to be a clone of a clone of a clone. It just started slowly breaking down their DNA, and this was not a good long-term solution, as eventually the clones would be born that are so fucked up they couldn't even survive. Lucky for them, a long, long time ago, before the Martian War ever even started, many Furons came to Earth and started breeding with human women. Because of this, there actually is remnants of pure Furon DNA within the human genome. So Crypto, a Furon soldier, is sent to the planet to harvest this DNA so they could possibly splice it in with their own and basically fix themselves from all the fucked up mutations and possibly grow their genitalia back. This is the initial plot of Destroy All Humans. Crypto himself is an ex-warrior from the Great Martian War, and He is a sadistic, violent psychopath who just fucking loves killing people. He loves it. It's like his favorite thing. And then once he finally does get his genitalia back, he becomes like super fucking horny in Destroy All Humans 2 because he's the first Furon in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that is actually able to, you know, bone people, which he is super excited about. So what exactly can Crypto do? And more importantly, could he survive in the War of the Monsters universe? Well, as I already said, Crypto is a member of the Furon race, and the Furon race is a very brutal, warlike race of galactic conquerors. But it is heavily implied, and also sometimes just straight up stated, that even compared to other Furons in his race, Crypto is particularly aggressive, brutal, and sadistic. He's also stated to be below average intelligence for a Furon, which really doesn't say a whole lot because even with that, he would still be far more intelligent than any human could possibly be. In terms of physical ability, he's one of the weakest characters that I've ever put into a survival challenge. It is directly stated as well as shown on multiple occasions that without all of his technology, he's actually considerably weaker and less durable than your average human being. Furons are short, fragile, and have very little muscle mass. However, his physical weaknesses are made up for by his Furon powers as well as his extremely advanced technology. In terms of his Furon powers, he has telekinesis, mind control, biological manipulation. He could straight up just blow up people's brains when he wants to. He has matter manipulation with the ability to alter the atomic structure of a human body to transform it into whatever he needs, even energy sources for his weapons and ammunition for his weapons. And that's not even talking about his technology like his energy shield that can defend against bullets and explosives and laser weapons. He has a jetpack and a massive arsenal of weapons, from everything that can open up a black hole to transform people and other shit. He can alter his own form in this sort of like hologram disguise thing. He has lightning weapons and weapons that can grow plants to attack people, and gravity weapons that make people start falling upwards. He has all different kinds of guns that shoot all sorts of energy, from electricity to plasma. He has a gun that can summon meteor from space. He has the ability to stop time, possess people, erase their memories, alter their memories, create illusions, heal from having giant holes blown in his chest in a couple of seconds. Overall, when he's boots on the ground fighting, he can basically take on a whole army by himself. But he doesn't actually have to have boots on the ground because he also has a flying saucer. And this flying saucer gives him not only more mobility, but also has significantly more firepower than he has when he's on the ground, and most notably has a weapon known as the Quantum Deconstructor that literally just erases matter from existence. And it is stated in the game that if that weapon comes in the hands of the wrong person, they can actually destroy the space-time continuum. However, it's important to note that Crypto is not the wrong person. He is not capable of using that weapon to do that. He's just not smart enough. But he can still use it as a big-ass gun that just erases shit. Now, knowing all this different stuff, how would he do if he arrived in the War of the Monsters universe? He'd get fucking throttled. For one, none of his Furon powers are going to work on any of the kaiju at all. Their range isn't really that great, so chances are if he's standing on the ground and they're standing in front of him, their head is so far up in the sky, it will likely still be out of range of his powers. Even if that weren't the case and he could fly up and use it or whatever, in his own games, he does fight a kaiju in Destroy All Humans 2, and none of his Furon powers work on it. Not his mind control or his biological manipulation or none of that shit. He can't affect it at all. They don't explain why. We could assume that this kaiju has some sort of resistance to it, but it's far more likely that it's due to the kaiju's size. It would take significantly more energy to biologically manipulate something that is 30 meters tall rather than someone who's 2 meters tall. Dominating the mind of a human being, which takes Crypto a couple of seconds to actually do it, he has to like focus his power and, you know, he has to stand there for a few seconds, would be much harder to do to a kaiju whose brain is like the size of a fucking trailer. It's just not something that I think would work. And even if it would work, and he would be able to mind control or biologically manipulate the kaiju, it won't work on any of the elemental characters like Magmo, Kineticlops, or Agamo, who just straight up don't have brains, and if they do, it's made out of some sort of rock, lava, lightning substance. And it's not going to work on any of the robots like Ultra V or Robo 47. So that means that he's going to have to completely rely on only his guns. And in terms of those, they're just not powerful enough to do all that much damage. His two most powerful weapons is a gun that summons a meteor from space and another gun that opens up a black hole. Black hole sounds great, but in the game, when he uses it, it only sucks up a couple of people. It doesn't even work on large vehicles. So why would it do anything to these kaiju? What's it gonna do, suck their toe into a black hole? Who gives a shit? The black hole's only open for a couple of seconds anyway. Best case scenario, he rips a toe off, Maybe. And as for the meteor gun, which is shown in game to be his most destructive weapon, it can actually come down and destroy whole buildings, but to the kaiju, it's like the size of a basketball. Maybe. And if it comes down, they just swat it out of the way or it hits them in the head. I mean, the kaiju themselves can fall from space and smash on the ground. So I don't know why a rock falling from space and hitting them would do all that much damage. It's certainly not going to take them out. And while Crypto does have an energy shield that defends him against attacks, that energy shield can be broken by regular guns from regular dudes on foot with handguns and rifles and machine guns and laser guns and all that kind of stuff. So if it can be damaged that way, a swipe from the hand of a massive kaiju would instantly destroy the shield and turn Crypto into fucking paste. So that leaves the only way he could possibly fight against any of these kaiju is by using his flying saucer. But that's not going to work either because the humans in War of the Monsters have set up this energy field across the whole planet that automatically disables flying saucers. That's how the plot of the game started. A bunch of aliens showed up in flying saucers, and then this electric field like activated and knocked out all their ships out of the sky, and they crashed, and then none of their technology worked, so they were stuck here, and then the fuel from their ship started getting on everything and creating all these monsters. Now, I don't know what this energy field is. It can't be an EMP, because if it was, it would shut down all technology on Earth as well as the flying saucers. But it doesn't, it just shuts down the aliens' technology. And we really have no evidence that Crypto's ship would be in any way resistant to this. So yeah, when he arrives at the planet, he's gonna get hit by this field, crash land, all of his weapons on his ship are gonna be useless, and he's gonna have to fight on foot. But let's just say for a second that's not the case, and the ship doesn't get knocked out. The only weapon on the ship that's actually going to do a decent amount of damage to one of the monsters is going to be the quantum deconstructor. But the problem with that is its area of effect damage. The quantum deconstructor shoots a little laser, and when it hits, makes a field of about 15 meters and explodes and deletes everything within those 15 meters. This will one-shot certain monsters, like you will be able to one-shot, say, Kongar if you hit him in the head or the upper body. It will erase him, leaving only his legs intact. But for certain monsters, it's not going to be able to take them out. Characters like Agamo, Magmo, and Kineticlops, who are made out of energy and substances and can just regrow themselves, the only way it would work is if he completely deleted them all in one shot, and he can't because the area of effect of the deconstructor is not bigger than they are. Even if he hits them completely center mass, he would really only cut them off at maybe the knees, and then they would just be able to regrow. There's also the problem that Crypto's ship is not that durable when compared to just how hard the monsters in War of the Monsters can hit. If you look at the nuclear explosion that happened on the island, and look at the fact that it did not damage any of the monsters at all, not even a little bit, but yet monsters can damage each other with their fists, you would kind of have to scale their physical punches and long-range attacks really, really fucking high. And the fact that every single monster on the roster has a long-range attack means that they could blow his ship out of the sky immediately after seeing him. So the only way Crypto could possibly survive is if he literally never gets hit and then just drives his ship around perfectly, trying to erase only the monsters that he's capable of erasing and fighting no one else. Never fighting more than one monster at a time, because any one of them can shoot at him and he'll be instantly knocked out of the sky. And that's not really possible because the number of monsters that exist in the War of the Monsters universe are a ton. At one point, an entire ant pile gets turned into kaiju. Do you know how many ants are in an ant pile? I don't fucking know, but it's a lot. There would have to be hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of kaiju in this universe. And there are very oftentimes fights that you get in this game, in the story of the game, where there are 4 or more kaiju all fighting in the same small area together. Crypto will not be able to fly around in this saucer all willy-nilly and just never get hit ever. But again, it's never going to come to that anyway, because he's going to get knocked out of the fucking sky by the defense system. So yeah, this is very one-sided. The only reason why I have him over Godzilla is because he's small and he may be able to avoid a fight if he can. I don't know if his personality would permit him to do that, because he likes fighting so much. But if he really needed to avoid conflict, it should be relatively easy with how tiny he is. Also, he does have a cloning device on his ship that every time he dies, a clone of him is made on the ship and he can continue the fight. That cloning device should be deactivated if he comes to the planet and all of his tech is fried. But if he is smart enough to keep his ship out of orbit and then he could like fly down in pods or something, maybe he can do something there. Like he could just keep coming back again and again and again. But these are a lot of ifs. lives, and for the most part, he's dead. Next up, we have Earth Defense Force from the Gynecologist Simulator series. In particular, the new timeline that starts at 5, because there was an old timeline from the start of the game up until 4, but then it got completely undone, and it was erased via time bullshit shenanigans, and now 5 and 6 is a new timeline. That's what we're going to be talking about today. The Earth Defense Force is a force that was created to defend the Earth. Yeah, I know. Crazy. And in this timeline, the EDF were created for the sole purpose of fighting against the Primers. And the Primers are probably the most brokenly overpowered alien invasion force ever put in games ever. They're just so bullshit. The Primers are an alien species that at the time the game takes place don't actually exist yet. They won't exist for billions and billions of years. But the reason why they're here and fucking with the Earth Defense Force is because they're time travelers. They have the ability to go anywhere across all of time and space and do whatever they want, and that's what they did. They kept doing it until they fucked up their entire existence, and then the only way to survive is to wipe out Earth, so that's what they try to do. The thing that makes the Primers so brokenly overpowered is the fact that you can't really kill them. Because the Primers have complete control over all of time and space, they can go back and forth freely. And if you kill a Primer, like if you defeat the Primers now, they will just send another version of the Primers from an alternate future timeline that's even more powerful because they decide to pull them from a farther point in the timeline. You know what I'm saying? Like the army that makes up the Primer forces is just a random grab bag of bullshit things that it grabbed from different timelines and different periods. Like one of the units that they use are giant ants. And they got those ants billions of years in the future in a timeline where humanity died out and then bugs were just left to evolve freely and just became giant mutated bug monsters. They pull everything from robots to frogmen to giant flying saucers and everything else you could possibly think of. And it doesn't matter how many times you defeat all the random bullshit they decide to throw at you, there's always more timelines for them to pull bullshit from. And they can do it from literally the same individual person. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, at the end of 5, you end up fighting this being known as the Nameless. That is basically like the Primer God, sort of. He's like the oldest, most powerful, most evolved Primer that exists in all of time. He ends up becoming the last boss at the end of 5. You fight him, you kill him, you deal with him, it's done. And then 6 rolls around, and what they end up doing is they go into a different timeline and then go further into the future, grabbing Nameless again, and then bringing him back, but this time, because they brought him at a farther point in the timeline, he's evolved to the point where he no longer looks like a giant dude. He looks like this giant flying centipede thing, and he's vastly more powerful than he was the last time you fought him, and you have to fucking fight him again. And it's just this thing that gets more and more frustrating for the EDF, where it's like, we can't possibly win this. Now, eventually they do, because they accidentally cause a time paradox that erases all the Primers from all timelines and all of existence at the same time. But just to be clear, if I took the Primers and I put the Primers in the world of War of the Monsters would fucking lose. It doesn't matter how powerful War of the Monsters are. Eventually, the Primers would send back something at some point in the timeline where technology and evolution had surpassed the War of the Monsters. Primers are more or less unbeatable by anything that can't erase all timelines at the same time or erase something's conceptual existence. Outside of that, you just can't beat them. But luckily for War of the Monsters, we're not using the Primers, we're using the EDF, the Earth Defense Force. And in terms of the Earth Defense Force, what they can do is just blow shit up with really, really, really fucking big guns. That's it. That's literally the only thing Earth Defense Force does. They just happen to do it better than basically anything else in fiction. The planet Earth in this series has the biggest, most powerful, most insane fucking army you could possibly think of, because it is constantly under attack by giant monsters and aliens and weird creatures and fucking gods and all sorts of, like, it's just prepared to the most extreme that it can be to fight off literally any issue that could possibly come to Earth. Well, any issue that can be blown up. Their weapons are some of the most powerful, over-the-top shit you've ever seen. A regular, like, foot soldier, average asshole who joins the EDF could have a bazooka that could take out massive kaijus in a single shot, can wipe out whole cities, like just regular handheld weapons. That doesn't even count their massive 10-story tall mechs or anti-air technology. They just have such powerful shit. So knowing that going into this, will the EDF be able to defeat War of the Monsters? They'll be able to defeat the vast majority. They won't be able to take on all of them. And let me explain why. Because if you played EDF, you're probably rolling your eyes a little bit, because this universe is fucking insane. So one thing that the EDF are really good at is upgrading their technology at an insanely fast rate. At the beginning of 5, you have very powerful weapons, and at one point, probably in the first third of the game, you end up fighting a kaiju, and the EDF realizes that none of their weapons are capable of even damaging it. So you basically just retreat, and then the EDF works for a couple of weeks to try and make a new weapon that can actually harm them. And eventually you do. You make a weapon and you can take out the kaiju. Now for a little bit, the only weapon that can take out a kaiju is like a massive fucking cannon that is strapped to a big machine thing. But then eventually, after a few more weeks, they're able to put that same firepower into handheld weapons, and you can just straight up fight fucking kaiju on foot. So their technology evolves at an insanely fast rate. And basically anything that comes up against them, they can gain the power to overcome it very quickly. This means that it really doesn't matter at what point in the timeline we have them come into contact with War of the Monsters. Give them a couple of weeks and they'll figure out weapons that can blow up all the kaiju. Even if we throw in the EDF at their absolute weakest and their weapons aren't going to be usable against them, just give it like a week or two and they'll be fine. But the reason why EDF won't actually be able to deal with all of the kaiju is because they're very single-minded, like to an extreme extent. Technically, if you actually want to look at the technology that the EDF has and compare it to the technology of War of the Monsters, the War of the Monsters scientists are a lot better. In both War of the Monsters and EDF, they both have an invasion of aliens that come down on flying saucers. In EDF, how they solve that problem is they don't. They just make really fucking big guns, give it to their soldiers, and they have this ongoing war where they're just having soldiers on foot blasting fucking flying saucers out of the sky with nuke launchers and shit. And that's it. And they've been doing this shit for years. Again, they didn't actually overcome the primers until they accidentally caused a time paradox. And they caused that time paradox by fucking nuking a planet to the point that it was uninhabitable, but it was the planet that the primers were going to eventually exist on. So they sort of made this weird paradox where they killed a planet before the primers existed, but they wouldn't have killed that planet unless the primers came to them. So it was a time paradox. But no matter what issue they come across, their answer is always bigger and bigger and bigger guns, more and more powerful explosions. By comparison, in the universe of War of the Monsters, when the aliens showed up in their flying saucers, the humans created this massive network of pulse weapons, basically, that just all went off at the same time, creating a protective layer around the entire planet that any alien ship that flew into it would automatically deactivate and crash land on Earth. They came together as a society and created this technology to defend their planet very shortly after the aliens got there. EDF has been at war with aliens and monsters and shit forever, and they still haven't figured out how to deal with them. This idea to make a massive world-spanning EMP blast that wiped out all the alien technology hasn't even occurred to them. The only things that they do is build bigger guns. And while that will work on most of War of the Monsters, it's not gonna work on all of them. How the fuck is a bigger gun gonna do anything to Kineticlops who's made out of electricity? How are they gonna kill a dude made out of lava with just a really big explosion? My question here, and really the main issue here that EDF is gonna face, is what exactly does an organization like them do, who has always been able to solve their problems with bigger guns, when they find themselves in a situation where the size of their guns is completely irrelevant? They would have to build some sort of technology that can completely eliminate or disperse the electrical energies of Kineticlops. What would they even do for living lava? Like, they would basically have to erase the lava or somehow like remove the life from the lava. There's no evidence whatsoever that they have technology like that. It's literally just bigger and bigger and bigger guns. Now, I'm not gonna pretend like they're fucking stupid and they won't try something else when they realize that guns don't work, but that doesn't mean they're going to suddenly come up with whole new technologies that don't exist in their universe anywhere. There is literally nothing, not that they have or that the primers have, that are capable of removing life from a substance that shouldn't have life. That's a very specific issue that they're going to have to get around. Now, could they trap it somehow? Maybe. That will definitely be more possible. But then you also have the possibility of something like Kineticlops basically multiplying itself to making an army of them. Or someone like Agamo who could literally just create molecules. Is there any evidence that they can create a cage that would stop him from creating molecules outside the cage and escaping that way? There's just so many different factors to think about when you're talking about this particular matchup that there's no evidence to suggest that the EDF can actually create that kind of technology given any amount of time at all. So for this one, can the EDF overcome War of the Monsters? Possibly. They can certainly overcome most of them. But there's a couple of those monsters they're going to come into contact with where they just don't have that kind of stuff. So I'm going to say it's possible, maybe somehow they can come up with something, but it ain't going to be easy and it doesn't seem all that likely. But it is probably just a matter of time, and that's really all you can kind of get from this matchup. There's just too many factors that are up in the air and we can't confirm one way or another. Last up, but certainly not least, we have Kafka Hibino from Kaiju number 8. The Kaiju number 8 universe takes place in an alternate Japan in a world where Japan is constantly under attack by massive fucking kaiju. Because of this, the whole society has sort of altered the way it works around fighting back against these massive kaiju. It actually, in many ways, is very similar to EDF. Ever since I started reading this manga, I've always thought that it's basically a manga adaptation of Gynecologist Simulator. The main character of this series is Kafka, and he's basically your stereotypical shonen protagonist that has this strong willpower and will never give up on his dreams and all this. He's like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna complete this goal and become the best, whatever, ever. You get it. It's a shonen protagonist thing. Or at least he was when he was a child, but this story takes place after he's already given up on his goal and he couldn't quite hack it, and then he just became like a 30-something just waste of flesh. And now that he's over the hill, kind of working a dead-end job and going through a bit of an early midlife crisis, has decided to go back and try his goal again, which is to join the Japan Defense Force and become the best of their organization and help fight off these monsters. And yes, the Japan Defense Force is basically just the Earth Defense Force, only for Japan instead of the entire Earth. Like I said, these series are basically identical. However, this time Kafka doesn't fail because he gets in this big accident with a kaiju and he gets this weird parasite in his body that allows him to turn into a kaiju as well. Not gonna go into detail as to why that is. It has this whole thing to do with his ancestry and all kind of stuff. Don't worry about it. Point is, he is now a human who can turn into a kaiju, and he uses those abilities to help him fight against other kaiju along the Japan Defense Force. So the question then becomes, can Kafka or Kafka and the Japan Defense Force fight against the entirety of the War of the Monsters universe? Well, when you look at the general strength levels of Kafka and the other kaiju in the universe, they immediately seem far stronger than anything in War of the Monsters. However, that's really just because they're a lot flashier. So, like, when Kafka punches something, it'll make this massive shockwave and destroy a large section of a city. It's anime. Anime is very exaggerated. When you look at something like War of the Monsters and you punch a dude, it just looks like you punch a dude, and then he'll eventually fly across the city if you do a full combo, but it just looks like, a kaiju punching another kaiju. However, when you take into effect the things that these kaiju can survive without taking any damage at all over the course of the story, it suddenly makes those punches that don't seem all that exaggerated really fucking powerful. It starts to make Kafka's punches seem far less impressive. At least not as impressive as they are in his own universe, where he could basically one-shot most things he comes across. Kafka with a punch might be able to blow a hole through a mountain, but does that compare to being at the epicenter of a nuclear blast that's big enough to wipe out an island and multiple cities miles away on the coast of a totally different piece of land? I don't know. I'm not a fucking mathematician. But these are two massively powerful attacks, and if you put them up against one another, I think they're close enough to say that characters on both sides should be able to harm the other. In terms of speed, it's kind of the same situation. Kafka can travel many times faster than sound. And while none of the kaiju in War of the Monsters are shown being able to travel many times faster than sound, they can react to attacks that are many times faster than sound. Even things like lasers and other projectiles that are clearly much faster than sound. So while they don't travel that fast, they are capable of reacting to those speeds. So I'm going to say that their speeds are comparable. However, Kafka's going to get the edge on speed overall. In terms of their things like regen and survivability, again, super close. Both characters have the ability to negate the regen of the opponents they're fighting against. And overall, just a lot of stats on both sides and powers on both sides are very, very similar. Similar enough that these two universes actually blend together relatively well. Where Kafka is going to find issues in the War of the Monster universe is the same place where all the other three universes had trouble with. The fact that there are certain kaiju that you can't just fucking punch to death. You can't shoot them to death. You can't physically harm them in any way. Kafka doesn't have any powers that would allow him to harm characters like Kineticlops, like Magmo, like Agamo. These three kaiju together are really just a hard fucking stop for the vast majority of universes, except not necessarily for kaiju number 8. There is a way that they can overcome them, and that is that Japan Defense Force has the ability to take body parts of kaiju and create suits and weapons from those body parts that have the same powers of those monsters. The monsters in War of the Monsters are capable of killing the kaiju that should be unkillable. They can punch lightning. They can kill living lava by punching it. They have some sort of ability to negate or bypass these crazy ass fucking defenses that all these characters have. Despite the fact that Agamo can grow his fucking head back, he can still be punched to death by Kongar. Nothing's broken. His head's still there, but he's just dead now because Kongar's powers just don't give a fuck about Agamo's powers, and that's the way all of these monsters work. So, if the Kaiju number 8 universe wants to be able to fight against the War of the Monsters universe, they would have to defeat certain kaiju that have the power to defeat the unkillable kaiju, and then use the body parts of those kaiju to create suits and weapons that they can then use to harm those kaiju that are normally unharmable. Basically, they're copying the powers of War of the Monsters in order to help them overtake them. So the question then becomes, are they capable of taking out the monsters in War of the Monsters so they can then build the suits to fight against the ones that they straight up can't fight? Like, would Kaiju number 8 and other members of the Japan Defense Force be able to fight against Kongar or Praetor or any of these other less invincible kaiju? And the answer to that is yes, but certainly not easily. There are a lot of powers between the two that are very, very similar, but I think that the abilities that Kaiju number 8 have that are better than the abilities that the War of the Monsters characters have are not as good as the reverse. So like I said, Kaiju number 8 is slightly faster than any of the monsters in War of the Monsters. That's cool. That will be useful. Not quite as useful as the War of the Monsters ability to completely negate any regen. Kafka Hibino does have an answer to regen. When he hits people, he can vastly slow down their ability to regenerate, but he can't eliminate it entirely. He just weakens it greatly. That means that if he gets into a fight with Kongar, every time Kongar hits him, for the first time ever in Kafka's whole history of being a kaiju, he's not going to be able to regenerate from any attacks, and while Kongar will not be able to regenerate as easily, he's still going to be able to generate a little bit. This is going to give him a massive advantage over Kaiju number 8. But then you go over to Kaiju number 8, and Kaiju number 8 can only be killed if you destroy his core. Whereas Kongar is definitely harder to kill. Like I said, he can have a fucking massive hole blown in his chest and still fight. But with enough physical damage to his body, he will eventually go down. But overall, Hibino's body can certainly take more damage. So which one here is better? Kongar being able to slightly heal from any damage he gets and being able to take a lot of damage before he goes down? Or Kafka, who could literally only die if his core is destroyed, but will not be able to heal from any damage at all whatsoever? And even going past that a little bit, the War of the Monsters universe has way more kaiju than the Kaiju number 8 universe. Most of the fighters in the Kaiju number 8 universe, whether you're talking about kaiju or just regular soldiers, are nowhere near as powerful as the top tiers. Whereas if you go over to the War of the Monsters universe, all of the kaiju are far closer in power. So while Kongar is kinda sorta similar in power to somebody like Kaiju number 8, so is literally every kaiju in that universe. Whereas in Kaiju number 8 universe, it's only the absolute top tiers who will be capable of fighting against any of the kaiju. I mean, there are weaker kaiju in War of the Monsters. Like there's that army of ant kaiju that get killed in a couple of hits, but that's not the majority. There are a sizable number of kaiju that are spread all across the world that are just as powerful as Kongar, if not more. I mean, shit, Earth in War of the Monsters has those giant fucking mechs that they've created a whole army of just to fight against the other monsters. And those robots are equivalent to that of someone like Kongar. So it must be assumed that there are hundreds, if not thousands of monsters in the War of the Monsters universe that are of equivalent power to Kongar. We also see this with the levels that you fight characters like Raptros, where Raptros is very comparable to someone like Kongar, but he's not the only dragon. There's like 3 or 4 other ones just as strong as he is. And there's likely more all over the planet. So in a universal war between Kaiju number 8 and War of the Monsters, Kaiju number 8 can fight back and can overcome, but they are vastly outnumbered by characters who are just as good as Kaiju number 8's most powerful beings. Their only real way of possibly winning this is that they can take out some Kaiju, possibly organize multiple people versus one or something like that, where they overcome one Kaiju, take his body parts, make a weapon out of it, and then build up enough soldiers with those weapons through technological advancements to then be able to harm all of them and take them down much, much faster and more easily, and then they could slowly start getting better at actually fighting them, and then make their way through the whole planet, wiping out all the monsters they can. Will they ever be able to wipe out all of them? No. In War of the Monsters, an entire fucking ant colony becomes kaijus. As long as they can still breed, there's no way you're getting rid of all the kaiju. You're probably gonna have trillions of those motherfuckers after a couple generations. So in summary, can Kaiju number 8 overcome the War of the Monsters, or at least survive relatively well? Yes, they can, but it's gonna be fucking tough. It's gonna be super tough. The reason why they're over EDF is because EDF doesn't really have a way to put down the toughest kaiju, and Kaiju number 8 does. It's just gonna be stupidly fucking hard to actually do it, but it is possible. So I think for the Kaiju number 8 universe, survival is definitely possible. Fighting back is also possible, but just outright winning, probably not possible. No, I don't see that happening. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, and join the membership. Remember, if you join the membership, you get videos early. And always remember, y'all stay safe out there, you hear?